So today we're going to take a look at Atheism, a very short introduction, which is very thin, by Julian Baggini, which is part of the very short introduction series put out by Oxford University Press. In general, I'm impressed with the series as well as impressed with short introductions as a genre of book because it allows you to kind of get into the meat and potatoes of the ideas very, very quickly in a way that's kind of efficient for the reader, and sort of it's a good way to unpack ideas, especially if you're not sure what you want to read. Reading a sort of introductory book such as this gives you a good stepping off point, especially because at the very end of it, it does have a whole bunch of further reading materials. As you might suspect, the book is about atheism, and it is largely coming from the perspective of being explanatory rather than argumentative. Right, it is not a atheism book that is trying to necessarily convert people or to bash theism. In fact, it's quite the opposite. It's a more detached and intellectual pursuit of the thing and trying to explain it in such a way, in my opinion, coming from the sort of attitude of Julian Baggini wants to make atheists behave, or not make, but perhaps persuade atheists or give atheists a perspective that allows them to be more compatible in society with theists, and vice versa. So theists can kind of better understand atheists, and it's coming from this very constructive sort of paradigm. Now, the book doesn't have too many chapters. He first starts off with what is atheism is the first chapter, and then the case for atheism, very short version of it, is that atheism is generally kind of demonized publicly, and he talks about that quite a bit, especially among theists, as a sort of negation of all things considered good. And what Julian Baggini makes the argument for is that it's really not, shouldn't be thought of as an attack on atheism, although he later talks about, an attack on theism, although he later talks about militant atheism, which is definitely an attack on theism, but instead it is a sort of more of a skeptical position, where instead of, the atheist believes much less the assertion that it is false that at least one deity exists, or at least the most common type of atheist that would be called a hard atheist, although he doesn't cover that distinction in the book. And instead, an atheist is more technically agnostic, although Baggini goes into why that's not necessarily a good faith position, but the idea is they suspend judgment, and the atheist believes that there's just no good evidence for God's existence, and what they demand is a sort of evidence, and they don't think that there is one for the theist position, and that this is more where atheists in general are coming from. Then the next chapter is on atheist ethics, which goes into sorts of asks a little bit of a question. There's in early on into the chapter, which is, I think, a good thought experiment or a way of looking at it, which is, are all the theist believes that God, or most theists, like monotheistic discipline, believes that God is good and everything that God prescribes is good. And so, but then this raises the question, is it good because God prescribes it? And if the things are good only because God prescribed it, then it seems one would think that all these things are rather arbitrary. If God were to prescribe something else, like the eating of children, which is obviously a flippant example, then it would be moral on this basis, and most people don't think that this kind of is a very good, that it's not this. It's not the case that it's moral because God prescribes it. It is the case that God prescribes it because it's moral, which implies that it is moral before God. And the fact that people can kind of discern what would be moral before God implies that one is able to determine what is moral without a God. And for Baggini, this is an argument that atheists can be moral, which is one of the common objections to atheism, that an atheist cannot be moral because without the sort of laws of God, or this sort of thing, they are devoid of morality. He also, of course, raises the question, or the rather insulting, or not insulting, but, if everyone is only being moral because they are afraid of eternal damnation, then perhaps they are not really being moral in this sort of way, because to be moral is to be good, independent of this sort of fear of punishment, at least in Baggini's eyes, and I think in most of society's eyes. If you have unlimited power and you just wield it over people and abuse people, because you have no fear of retribution, this is not a moral, a person who behaves only because they are not afraid of punishment is not a moral person. Okay, and then he talks about meaning and purpose, and how the atheists can still achieve, a sense of purpose. Largely, a big part of it is, thinking of eternal life, or this is a big part of the chapter, and this sort of thing. But if your life is only meaningful in order to get to a next life that is prolonged or eternal, depending on your belief system, then it's a sort of deferment of a same sort, because if this life cannot be meaningful because there's a next one coming, then why is the next one meaningful? This is kind of one of the arguments. I'm not really re-articulating it that well, but he goes into several kinds of ways of looking at meaning and this sort of stuff, and he kind of comes to the conclusion that it's meaning is a largely psychological condition that is like native to part of the human condition, and is largely about being goal-oriented and, moving towards values and this sort of thing. Although I don't think his analysis is necessarily too terribly robust on what exactly meaning is, but it is on kind of responding to a sort of critique of atheism, which is that it's devoid of meaning. Although he does mention that, I think he mentions Sartre talking about existence precedes essence, and so the rise of the existentialists and this sort of stuff kind of in response to the question of what does morality and meaning look like after God, which was kind of raised in the 1800s, 1900s, can't quite remember when Sartre was kicking around. And then we get to atheism in history, so speaking of kicking around, and he responds to a couple of criticisms, which is that, the atheist, one of the criticisms of atheism is that it is used to justify pretty significant atrocities in the early 20th century, late 19th century, is that right? And he kind of responds to them one at a time. He notes that, the fascist and fascism and atheism are often linked, and he says that this kind of is a rather relatively spurious link, with the exception of the Soviet Union, but I'll get to that one. He talks about Spain, how Spain was fascist, how, that is the Spanish, part of the Spanish Revolution, there's the Republicans versus the fascists, and the fascists align themselves with religion pretty squarely. Talks about how there was like a treaty in which Mussolini recognized, Catholicism as the state religion, which is definitely not an atheistic position. He talks about Hitler. I forget the Hitler example. But I know on their belt buckles there it's like, God is with us, like Gott mit, what is it? Gott mit something, uns? I know that was on the Nazi belt buckles and that sort of thing. That's not what Baggini talks about, but, there's also, in 1933, there was, a treaty between, which was never renounced, between the Vatican and the Nazi Germany. So there's that. But the Soviet Union was explicitly an atheist sort of thing, and Baggini's defense against this is twofold. One is that the Orthodox Church at the time was allowed to organize and never denounced Stalin at any point in time, and so there is that like covert or complicit sort of connection, even if it's not like explicit or like mentioned as part of the state. And then secondarily, he talks about just because a state is explicitly atheist doesn't mean that it is necessarily the atheism that is causing the immorality in the case of Stalin, or like the horrific things, although it was officially an atheist state. This isn't something I know too much about, but it is something that Baggini talked about, so to some extent I can't comment on it personally, but I think it's also, like, he notes that if you use that logic, then like all the Crusades and all the horrors of the Crusades have to be lumped in with religion, which I think is unfair, and I think Baggini thinks is unfair, and this sort of thing. And then he talks about against religion, which I think is probably the most fascinating or useful chapter, but this is largely because I'm already familiar with a lot of the arguments that are for atheism. And in this one, he makes the point that a lot of the arguments for the existence of God are not necessarily made to like demonstrate the existence of God. And he says if you're really taking a good faith examination on why people believe in God, usually it's a sort of faith position and not a rational inquiry type of position, and that a lot of the arguments for the existence of God are trying to make sense of the events of the world and make them compatible. In that extent, they are what are known as like apologetics in terms of philosophical terms, where it is just an explanation, more so, and it's not necessarily striving to be the best explanation, but rather kind of a satisfactory one. And, just because you can poke a hole in one of the arguments for the existence of God doesn't mean that someone who believes in God is going to stop believing in God. And he mentions that this isn't even like a productive sort of affair. He makes some other points that I think are really good. And one of them is kind of his his attack on a sort of more militant or aggressive version of atheism that in his mind is dogmatic, which is kind of where, near the end of the book, where the quote that I put on the splash comes from, where he says, "I think my opposition to militant atheism is based on commitment to the very values that inspire atheism. An open-minded commitment to the truth and rational inquiry." And so what he notes is that a lot of atheists would not want a state atheism sort of thing, because it is preventing the very sort of inquiry and open-mindedness that is underpinning atheism in this sort of way. Instead, most atheists would prefer is a secular state, one where people are free to practice whatever religion they want, as long as it is not enforced upon other people. And so what a state atheism would do is it would enforce religion on other people. And so he also disagrees not categorically, but he seems to generally disagree with the statement that religion poisons things or makes things bad. He seems to think that it's relatively net neutral. For those of you who have watched some other stuff on the channel, I do kind of do some reacts to Christopher Hitchens' works, and one of my critiques of Christopher Hitchens is that he is an anti-theist, and I think that theism versus atheism, in terms of what it does for the world or whether it makes people moral, I think they're both relatively net neutral. And one of my critiques of Hitchens is that he thinks that religion, and I quote, poisons everything. And so I think that this is incorrect. I just think that the evidence does not support the existence of God. So generally I'm in agreement with Baggini here, but also that people should live together and people should be allowed to believe what they want to believe and do what they want to do, as long as it's not harming other people. So, that's kind of what I think is a relatively short summary of the book, although, considering how thin the book is, maybe it should have been a whole lot shorter. As far as the ratings go, let's get into them. So for utility, I gave it a 7. One of the reasons that utility is propped up here, by the way, is that it's a very short read, and anytime you're judging utility, you have to judge it relative to how fast you can read it. If you can read 3 of these very short introduction books in the same time it would take you to read another nonfiction book, you could get away with having 1/3 of the utility. I'm very happy with these books as a series. Even if you're not interested in atheism, I would recommend them. Oxford University Press puts out a lot. I've never been disappointed with any of their products in a general sense. I think their editorial oversight is very good, and this is, I think it's useful, or it gets kind of an efficiency bump on the utility, but beyond that, I think that the book is useful because if you're religious, and you want to understand atheists better, that this is a very good read. And it's not like aggressively anti-religious or anything like that, or even anti-religious in my estimation. It's explanatory, it's conciliatory, from both directions in my estimation, although Baggini is obviously an atheist, and this is obviously the position he holds, so to some degree, it might not be let's say, most generous to the theist position. But I think if you're a theist and you want to understand, or if you're religious and you want to understand atheism better, this would be a good shout. And especially because, the proportion of atheists is rising in the United States at the very least, and I believe in most of the Western world. I think it's roughly at a quarter, maybe it's at a little bit higher than that, but this is kind of where things are. But I also think if you're an atheist, I have met a lot of, I suppose the loud atheists probably are more in this party, but I've met a lot of atheists who I think are kind of jerks about their own beliefs, and that they are, let's say, militant atheists, as Julian Baggini describes them, and I think that, having a more nuanced appreciation for the theist position that is not rooted in just agreeing with what they say, but instead seeing where they're coming from and understanding the way that they are thinking. I think that in particular the last 2 chapters are good for this. I think that this is useful on that grounds as well. And again, it's very short, very quick read. So yeah. As far as novelty, I gave it a 6.5. I think that if you are on either side of these camps, if you have just always been, a theist, and you've never been exposed to the atheist arguments, I think it's tremendously useful. Now, there's plenty of places you can find arguments for atheism, so it's not novel in that sense, but if you've never been exposed to them ever, and you just think that it's like insidious witchcraft or something like this, I think that it's not coming from a place necessarily of adamantly rejecting religion, although some pieces of writing and material are, but more coming from a place of, rationalism and a... what is the second word? Naturalism, where you are trying to look for the best explanation of events, and those don't pan out to supporting God, according to most atheists. Not looking to be especially controversial in this video, or really do a commentary on religion, because I think it's generally divisive, one way or the other, negation or affirmation. But I think it is useful to understand other people and other perspectives, and especially if you are really entrenched in your perspective, whatever it is, on anything, reading something that is contradictory to your perspective, I think is tremendously useful in all things, not just religious. Like, for example, if you think competition's the best, the book The Case Against Competition by Alfie Kahn might be interesting. I was that way, and then I read the book The Case Against Competition, and I still think competition in some sense is truth-revealing, but not to the same degree I did before reading Kahn's book. I think being able to change perspective is important, and this book offers that opportunity, and that's where the novelty comes from. Entertainment, I scored out of 4. It's not overly dry and academic. Julian Baggini is an academic philosopher, but he kind of writes for mainstream. I've read some of his other books, or I've read one of his other books multiple times, and so the book is The Ego Trick, I believe, and I found that book good. This book was fairly... It's okay. It's covering something, it's trying to do it quickly, and it's not obviously going to have like a story arc or something like this, or entertaining anecdotes, because he's trying to be clear and concise. For style, I give it a 7. I'm generally a fan of his writing style. It is clear and concise, which is why readability gave it a 7. For interest, I gave it a score, for interest, I gave it a score. This is a score, this is a review. Here we are. For interest, I give it a 6. And the main reason is that I thought it was generally slightly interesting. I guess maybe if I hadn't already seen a lot of the arguments for atheism before, it might have been more interesting. But I've seen a lot of the arguments. They're not especially novel to me at this point, although some stuff was refreshing. There's some stuff I wasn't kind of aware of. I was a big fan of, in the back of the book, future readings, like a lot of good ideas for other stuff to read. But yeah, it wasn't not interesting, but it didn't necessarily move the needle. A lot of it was reminding me of things I've already seen, especially like the ethics section. He talks about like the 3 big ethical like positions as well in philosophy, which is like one of them is like virtue ethics from like Nicomachean ethics, where it's more of a stylized sort of ethics where it's practice based and not as much about prohibitions and musts, and more about having a practice that is sort of stylized, which is kind of probably too much to unpack in this video. And then there's rules-based ethics, like you have to do this, you can't do that. And then there's consequence-based ethics, or consequentialism, utilitarianism, where you just look at what are the effects of your actions, and then, this sort of thing. In a lot of that ways, it's stuff I've already seen, but if you've never seen it, it's actually probably pretty interesting. So maybe interesting should score higher. A little bit of a digression there. For an overall score, respectable 6.25, pretty solid. As far as recommendations go, I think I would generally recommend this to anyone who is either really, for anyone who is a theist and wants a bit of an introduction to sort of an atheist position that is not hostile, because I think a lot of atheist kind of geared stuff is kind of hostile to religion. This does not seem hostile, but it also thinks that religion is wrong, so there's that. As far as hostility goes, it's as low as you can get while still simultaneously thinking that the other position's wrong, or that is my assessment. And then I would also recommend this to people who are atheists that are perhaps of the militant kind, because I think that for the same reason, which is the tempering and the balance, this sort of thing I think is useful for reasons I discussed earlier, where you are trying to, balance your knowledge, because a big part of just being, developing a worldview in general is the ability to change your own beliefs. If you just continue to believe the first thing you believe, you're not very dynamic. And so it might not feel very smart, but admitting you're wrong and changing your beliefs about stuff is important, or refining your beliefs in light of other evidence so that they're more nuanced. Even if you don't completely change your entire position, just having a bit of a more refined sort of position, or being able to articulate why you believe something, might be useful. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, feel free to like, comment, or subscribe, or hit the notification bell. That's all the YouTube things. And other than that, have a good day. Happy reading.